Listenbourg is a country located in the Iberian Peninsula in Europe. It borders Spain and Portugal and is connected to the Atlantic Ocean and the Bay of Biscay. The country has 5 major provinces, 3 of which being autonomous regions for their unique ethnicities and languages. The regions are as such. Fleucherbe. This mostly Lower Saxon-speaking region houses the nation's capital of Listenbourg. One thing that everyone always points out about Fleucherbe is how insanely beautiful it is. The awe-inducing architecture is complemented very nicely by the native fauna of the region, creating scenes that people often describe as dreamlike, with one of the most popular tourist cities in the region being Lorensburg. Another unique region is the autonomous province of Cassier, which is mostly inhabited by ethnic Galicians living in the area. The autonomy allows them to teach their native language in school and preserve their culture. Then there is the region of Midtjylland, which is by far the largest region in the country, yet also the most sparsely populated because of its size. This region is a bit of a melting pot of all the other cultures on the peninsula. It houses a sizable amount of Galicians in the eastern administrative districts, with Portuguese in the south, Livonians in the west, and Germans in the central and northern districts. This melting pot of cultures has given Midtjylland a reputation of being one of the most migrant-friendly regions in Europe, a reputation which they are extremely proud of. The fourth region and second autonomous region I want to talk about is Kusterde. This region is mainly made up of many old Scandinavian and Baltic ethnicities, with Livonian forming a slight majority over the others. And the final autonomous region is Andreas. This region is mainly populated by the Portuguese. It's known for housing many of the popular tourist beaches in Listenbourg, getting most of their economic prosperity from said tourism. The history of Listenbourg doesn't get talked about very often, and I honestly think that's a real shame. Which is why I wanted to make this video today to show you all the history and the culture of this beautiful country. So let's do some history. In 150 BC, the area we now know as Listenbourg was most likely populated by a tribe of people called the Lisanuo. We know of the Lisanuo from several ancient Roman transcripts, where the Lisanuo were described as incredibly courageous and determined fighters and highly capable diplomats. From these transcripts, we are led to believe that the Lisanuo and Romans had an unusually strong bond, but that didn't stop Julius Caesar from trying a shot at invading them 100 years later. During the Roman Civil War of 49 BC between Caesar and Pompey, Caesar marched into the Pompeian-controlled area of Iberia and narrowly managed to defeat the Pompeian legions in the Battle of Ilerda. Following this victory, Caesar blamed the Lisanuo of supporting Pompey and used this as a pretext for an invasion. It is important to note that Caesar wasn't doing this to annex the area. His plan was to win a few battles, raid the cities of the Lisanuo for supplies, and then demand hostages and troops from them, which he wanted to use against Pompey. Yet, things didn't go as planned. As Caesar marched into the lands of the tribe, a Lisanuan militia ruled by Joseph Sorelia sprung a trap they had laid in case something like this happened. They led Caesar into a forest, making him think he was facing against a much smaller force, and then flanked him, causing his army to rout, resulting in massive Roman casualties and Caesar pulling his men out of the lands of the Lisanuo. After winning the civil war, Caesar wanted to punish the tribe and got a golden opportunity to do so. Several German tribes approached Rome asking if they could be allowed to settle their people on the western area of the Rhine, promising that they would be great allies to the Republic and send troops and supplies. After negotiating for a bit, Caesar got 2 of the 3 tribes to accept moving to the area of the Lisanuo without mentioning people already lived there. He brutally slaughtered the 3rd tribe. When the Germans and Lisanuans came into contact with each other, the Germans knew they had been lied to, but still decided to settle there because they didn't want to upset Rome, which had now become much stronger and would be able to crush the Germans and Lisanuans in war. Thus, both tribes agreed to let the others exist. The Germans were allowed to settle in the areas of Fleucherbe and Midtjylland. This coexistence also made it so the Germans had to partially assimilate to the Lisanuan culture. In the 8th century, the entire political landscape of the region changed, as Iberia was invaded by the Muslims. Listenbourg managed to mostly survive the original invasion, and slowly with the help of other Christian kingdoms managed to push out the Muslims meter by meter. Though, in 844, Listenbourg got raided by Vikings for the first time, resulting in the burning of many small towns and villages along the coast. Listenbourg had been weakened massively from the war against the Muslims and thus couldn't repulse these Vikings, and the Vikings quickly realized that resistance was incredibly light and began to slowly raid deeper and deeper into the kingdom, until they at one point occupied as much as half of Fleucherbe, including Ludenburg and the coastal areas of Midtjylland. In an attempt to end these raids, King Juno of Gronvik met up with the leaders of these raids and had to agree to fairly harsh terms. The agreement was as follows. Listenbourg would cede the land of Kusterde to the Vikings. Listenbourg would pay for the lives of the raiders they killed and boats they destroyed. Listenbourg would form an alliance with the Vikings living in Kusterde, promising to help each other in times of war. In return, the Vikings would stop raiding the lands of Listenbourg and give an army of 10,000 soldiers to help Listenbourg in the Reconquista. For the next few hundred years, everything went somewhat smoothly, except for that one time the English burned Nuremberg down after a conflict about the Vikings. Yikes. But aside from that mishap, things seemed to be going up for the kingdom. The Muslims were a shadow of their former selves, raiding was a non-existent issue, and the royal family had managed to get themselves good relations with some of the strongest nations in Western Europe. Everything seemed well and nice until the 13th of February of 1402, when the Kingdom of Portugal declared war against the Livonians in Custerde and began a blockade of the sea. This put massive pressure on King Arnold Unison of Listenbourg, as he was bound by treaty to defend the Livonians living in these territories, but he didn't want to fight Portugal. Eventually, after a vote of the aristocrats in Nuremberg, the Kingdom of Listenbourg declared war on Portugal. What followed was 3 years of brutal warfare. While Listenbourg had a larger army, their men were less trained and had lower morale. Their weaponry was also less advanced than what the Portuguese were fighting with. Yet, even with these downsides, Listenbourg slowly managed to push deeper and deeper into Portugal, until finally on the 18th of August 1405, the Listenburgers won the siege of Lisbon and forced the Portuguese to sign a humiliating peace treaty. This treaty, better known as the Treaty of Grof-Limaan, included things like Portugal ceding a large chunk of Portuguese-speaking territory, paying war reparations, and only being allowed to have 6,000 troops in the Portuguese provinces bordering Listenbourg. They also had to release prisoners of war and cede part of their navy to Custerde. This massive victory strained the relations between Listenbourg and Castile, because Castile felt like the amount of land Portugal was forced to cede was way too much. Yet, in the end, after renewed diplomatic talks between both kingdoms, they managed to avoid a war. Following the war, Custerde actually held a referendum to join Listenbourg as an autonomous province, seeing how they kept their part of their 100-year-old treaty and defended them. The vote passed with 73% of people voting to join. Things were pretty calm again for the next few hundred years, and Listenbourg began to work on making a few African colonies. These colonies, located in modern-day Equatorial Guinea and Angola, weren't that large in size and were mainly used to get access to Indian spices. Yet, the ports were also used by Listenburgers for selling indigenous people into slavery, which is a rather dark part of the history of Listenbourg. These colonies didn't exist for too long though, because soon after all of this, a certain Napoleon had declared himself emperor, and Listenbourg saw an opportunity to solve a disputed land claim on Spain. Listenbourg and France had always had good relations, mostly because of their hatred for the English. This strong relation had persisted even with Napoleon in power, and both countries actually found themselves naturally allied with each other. The way they found themselves allied was in the Peninsular War, where after trying to make Spain his puppet, the Spanish revolted and began a guerrilla warfare campaign against Napoleon. Listenbourg had been wanting to fight a war with Spain over the disputed territories between them, and they thought this was the right time to help their French allies and get themselves that disputed territory. Yet, it seems like they miscalculated massively, as from the moment they joined the war they were getting pushed back and got blockaded by the United Kingdom, slowly starving out the populace. This is where in 1812, after Napoleon's defeat in Russia, King Geoffrey von Gliedvrich met up with the Spanish and Portuguese and asked for surrender. The Treaty of Surrender forced Listenbourg to revoke their claim on the disputed land with Spain and cede their colonial holdings, also paying war reparations and returning a piece of land to Portugal. Now let's rewind the clock a little to a few decades prior to these wars, because something important is going down in the Americas. That's right, I'm talking about the American Revolution. It is known that the revolutionaries had sent requests to France to send them support, but this was also forwarded to King Meister von Gliedvrich, the reigning monarch in Listenbourg at the time. After discussing the issue of the American revolutionaries, the Council of Foreign Assistance decided to send one of the Listenbourg elite legions to the revolutionaries to help train the militiamen there to be more organized and combat ready to fight against the British. The 3rd Custerde Elite Legion was picked for this mission and actually took part in several battles, most of which resulted in American victories. This is why you will find a monument about the 3rd Custerde Elite Legion in Philadelphia. And now back to the past, where the Napoleonic Wars just ended. Because Listenbourg had already surrendered to Spain and Portugal, they weren't forced to make any other concessions, but they also weren't allowed to partake in the Congress of Vienna. The humiliation of losing the Peninsular War made it so that King Geoffrey von Gliedvrich adopted a neutral foreign policy for the country, so they could focus on improving their army, improving their economy, and improving their infrastructure. 2 world wars came and went, and Listenbourg still hadn't given up on their neutral stance until 2008, when, following the Russian invasion of Georgia, Listenbourg applied for NATO membership, with Minister of Foreign Affairs Gaspard Hulscher stating that "We cannot remain neutral in a world where being neutral means you let the aggressor get away with it." This was followed by an application for Listenbourg to join the European Union in 2009. Both applications are still being worked on to this day, and we do not know a concrete date when Listenbourg will be allowed to join either institution. And I think that is the really peculiar thing about Listenbourg, the fact that after all this time, after all the hardships they faced, they're still around today and still manage to play such a pivotal role in global politics. The defiance and diplomacy of the Listenburgers throughout time has inspired many different books and movies and has deeply ingrained itself in the Listenbourg culture, which is something not many other countries can replicate, showing once again that we could all learn a thing or two from these unique people. Thank you for watching. This video was pretty fun to make, even if it was a bit tedious to work on at times. If anyone from Overly Sarcastic Productions is watching this, I just want to say that I appreciate your videos. The history videos are very entertaining, the trope talks are amazing, and the journey to the west is extremely enjoyable. You guys rock.